With his first foreign trip completed, Donald Trump returned to the White House to face more challenges. According to media reports, senior advisor Jared Kushner is under FBI scrutiny for his relationship with Russian officials during the transition period before Trump took office. In December, at a meeting with the Russian ambassador Sergei Kislyak, Kushner reportedly discussed creating secret back-channel communications between the Trump transition team and the Kremlin through a Russian diplomatic facility. We begin our coverage with CGTN's Jessica Stone at the White House. And Jessica, how is the Trump administration responding to these reports about Jared Kushner?
Well, they're not giving us very much information at all. You know, we asked Sean Spicer at the White House press briefing earlier today about Jared's status, about his involvement in these reports. And Press Secretary Sean Spicer basically pointed to what he's already said about Jared Kushner, and his lawyer has already said about Jared Kushner, which is that he is going to talk to the congressional committees, he's going to talk to the FBI about what he knows. Also attacking the reports himself. Sean Spicer repeatedly attacking the source of these reports, saying that they're anonymous sources, that these are unconfirmed actions, that he doesn't want to dignify them with a response, and also noting the Department of Homeland Security Secretary John Kelly and the National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster's statements over the weekend, which basically said there are instances where creating these back channels can be appropriate and in which they're actually routine.
Now, President Trump described his first overseas trip. He's just got back. He described it as a great success. But after the visit, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel said Europe can no longer rely on Donald Trump's America. Where do relations stand between these two leaders?
Well, I think one of the highlights of the briefing today was that question being put to Sean Spicer, and he said that the relations between Angela Merkel and Donald Trump are, frankly, fairly unbelievable, he said. He really went on to describe what he felt was a positive relationship between these two countries, arguing really that the substance of what the president was trying to convey is that each country in NATO contributing more to the alliance does help not only the alliance, but Europe and the United States. I'll have you take a listen, though, to that question being asked, because, of course, there were concerns raised by the fact that the president didn't articulate a full-throated endorsement of Article 5, the mutual defense part of the treaty with NATO, and also that caused German Chancellor Angela Merkel a lot of consternation. She made some remarks as well afterwards. I'll have you listen to what Sean Spicer said in response to those. Take a listen.
I think the relationship that the president has had with Merkel, he would describe as fairly unbelievable. They get along very well. He has a lot of respect for her. They continue to grow the bond that they had during their talks in the G7. And he views not just Germany, but the rest of Europe as an important American ally. During his conversations at NATO and at the G7, the president reaffirmed the need to deepen and improve our transatlantic relationship.
And, of course, one of the other sore points between these two allies is climate, something that German Chancellor Angela Merkel really wanted to be in the communique. The U.S. did not endorse that, and it didn't wind up being in the communique that was ultimately issued from the G7. No full endorsement of the Paris Climate Agreement. We know that the president came back and said he's fully considering whether to stay in, and we expect that decision sometime this week. Anand.
Thanks, Jessica. That's CGTN's Jessica Stone reporting from the White House. Now, for more on the Trump administration's troubles, joining us is Afshin Molavi. He's a senior fellow with the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Also with us is Ray McGovern. He was an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency for 27 years. Joining us from his Washington headquarters is Simon Marks. He's the president and chief correspondent for Feature Story News. And Lester Munson served as staff director for the Republican chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and is currently the vice president with BGR Group, a strategic consulting firm. Thanks to all of you for joining us. Let's go to Simon out there. Simon, if we look at this presidency, there hardly a day goes by when something bizarre happens. You know, we hear these allegations coming from the media, coming from officials. There's always something when Donald Trump is in the news. We now have a special prosecutor in place as well. Looking at the past 4 months and just looking at the past 2 weeks after the president had this foreign visit, are we looking at a presidency that's becoming crippled, really?
Well, I think a presidency that is becoming constrained, Anna, not entirely crippled, because remember, while Donald Trump is mired in crisis and the White House is mired in crisis, there is still the business of government getting done in a very small way, at a very low level at government departments all over the country, and certainly environmentalists, for example, would argue that Donald Trump, even though he's dealing with a political crisis, is already doing damage to the country's environment. There are other interest groups that would argue that Donald Trump is bringing a hatchet to their particular areas of concern. But there is no question that this is going to constrain him in a very big way when it comes to the big items that he wants to advance through Capitol Hill. His relationship with the legislature, particularly with the Senate, is becoming increasingly strained. You hear more skepticism among Republicans in the Senate about the future of his presidency with every day that passes. And with every day that passes, there just is this increasing sense that there is now so much smoke that somewhere there must be a fire burning, and the White House is able to do nothing to dampen down that sense, despite the presentation that Sean Spicer made there today, and perhaps, if he's still around tomorrow, will make there again tomorrow.
Ray, let's look at this latest bit of news that's got Washington talking, and that is that the president's son-in-law and one of his senior advisors, Jared Kushner, tried to establish some kind of secret communications line with the Russians. This was in the transition period, as we've been reporting. Now, we don't know whether this is true. This is what the media has been telling us. But what do you make of it?
Well, what I make of it is we don't know if it's true. It's always 3 former and retired CIA officials or something. So, you know, what we're dealing with is sort of unreality here. This is the media. They're having a wonderful time, but there's very little substance to what they're saying. They're trying to cripple the president. You know, whatever you think of the president, I don't think very much of him. He was elected properly by the electorate here. If the Hoy Aristoi, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, and the New York Times think they can get rid of them, well, you know, they're well on their way to doing that. But if they think that the 68 million people who voted for him are going to sit still for that, we have a real crisis that we haven't seen the likes of before in electoral history.
Afshin, what do you make of that? President Trump and his advisors are constantly complaining that this is fake news. And admittedly, a lot of the news is anonymously sourced.
Sure. There's a whole lot of leaking going on. I mean, I'm surprised Washington hasn't flooded with all this leaking that's going on in town. But look, I mean, I think you know, to Ray's point, you know, and you know, playing on Simon's point as well, yes, there's a lot of smoke, but you know, these are not, you know, Jared Kushner setting up a meeting with a Russian businessman is not technically illegal. It's poor judgment, it's reckless, it's ill-considered, but it's not technically illegal. So there's going to be a lot of investigative reporters looking for the fire that Simon was referring to. Right. But in the meantime, I think that, you know, what we're seeing is Donald Trump supporters hardening, you know, their support for Donald Trump because they think the elite media, to Ray's point, is out to get them. And let's also not forget that Bill Clinton had similar poll numbers at this stage of his presidency as Donald Trump.
Right, Lester, I want you to take a listen to what the U.S. Secretary for Homeland Security, John Kelly, had to say about these Jared Kushner allegations. Let's watch.
Just because you have a back channel, if indeed that's what Jared was after, doesn't mean that he then keeps everything secret. I mean, he shares that. But the back channels, as I understand it, and of course every administration has had it all the way, you know, forever. Back channel communications with people are ways to communicate with people. Again, not in front of the, you know, press as an example, but that information is, you know, not necessarily kept secret from the rest of the government.
So, Lester, is there anything illegal that Jared Kushner, even if this is true, is there anything illegal that he did, or is it unusual in any way? Is this the first time that we've heard of members of a campaign establishing back channels with other governments?
I don't think it's illegal. I do think if the allegations are true, there are some unusual aspects to this. If Mr. Kushner actually asked to have the meetings at the Russian embassy where they would be hidden from U.S. eyes and ears, that would be a kind of an unusual scenario. But again, these are unsubstantiated allegations. We don't know if this happened. We don't know if he tried to set up a channel. We also don't know if he actually used the channel. And one of the interesting aspects to me is the primary accusation against President Trump is that he has this inappropriate relationship with the Russian government. If he has that, why does he need to set up a secret back channel? Presumably, he already has that somewhere. So, I mean, there is a lot of smoke here, but it might be funny smoke, and I'm not really sure there is a fire.
And the question, Anand, is Vladimir Putin laughing in Moscow right now and saying, you know, I've set off a lot of smoke bombs in that town, and everybody's looking for the fire?
He is definitely laughing.
Simon, the media's taking a whipping here. What do you say?
Well, let me push back a little bit against that, Anand, because these are not entirely unsubstantiated allegations, and this is not a series of stories that is the invention of the media. I mean, there are some very clear, hard and fast facts. We know now that a substantial number of figures in Donald Trump's immediate orbit are the subject of a series of separate investigations. One in the Senate, two in the House of Representatives, now the subject of an investigation being spearheaded by a special counsel appointed by the Deputy Attorney General after Donald Trump's decision, not the media's decision, not the Democratic Party's decision, the president's decision to fire his FBI director, publicly claim at the time that he was doing it because James Comey did a terrible job of handling the investigation into Hillary Clinton's email use, but in every subsequent reference constantly appears to be suggesting that he fired the FBI director in order to derail or take out the sting of the Russia probe that James Comey was heading at the FBI. Now, those are substantiated facts, and so the media would be utterly remiss in its duty if it didn't continue to investigate all of these various stories and allegations, which, of course, are being fueled by the fact that Donald Trump's own White House, his White House, leaks like a sieve to a greater degree than any of its predecessors. So this is by no manner of means all on the media.
Okay. Ray, you want to say something?
Yeah, these are not proven facts. What was just said, that Donald Trump fired Comey to hide what the investigation was doing, that's not really what he said. He said this Russia thing. And the reason he fired Comey is that Comey's been investigating him for 11 months, leaking like a sieve, together with the people in the CIA and the NSA, and zero evidence of any kind of crime, including Russian hacking or any collusion, has been brought forth. Now, after 11 months, it begins to look a little bit like a witch hunt, and you don't need to be a paranoid president to look at it that way. He was fired because he was part of this little cabal that's trying to get at the president. It's the CIA, it's the NSA, it's the FBI. I've never seen them so apparently out to get the president, and they probably will. But this is not something that we should discuss as proven fact. You know, the business about the Russian leak, we keep hearing the references to that as a flat fact. You know, we know what the Russian leak was now. You know who did it? John Brennan. That's right. Now, this hasn't been in the New York Times, but WikiLeaks published a tranche of documents, original CIA documents, which talk about a Marble program, code name, and that enables the CIA to hack into various systems and computers, disguise who hacked in, and leave a little telltale signs like, oh, maybe Cyrillic, stuff like that. Now, that's what happened to the DNC computers, and Comey refused to investigate it. Did you see him before the House Intelligence? You know, sure, you know, it's certain that we should have gotten access to these computers. If you're going to do forensics, you shouldn't, you know, depend on somebody else. But we just never got the. Why didn't they get access? Because they didn't want access. Because the technicians would have said, "My God, this is so sophisticated. This probably cost about $700 million.
Right.
Let's go ask the NSA." See.
Okay. Okay. I want to move on now to something else. And Afshin, that is the president's visit. Sure. His first overseas visit. Two big meetings: the G7 meeting, the NATO meeting. He came back. He called it, quote, a great success. Others disagree. Others have not been so generous.
Sure. And I think the G7 meeting, it's hard to classify that as a great success. And I think this rift with Angela Merkel, despite the fact that Sean Spicer described the relationship as fairly unbelievable, which I'm not sure what that means, but I think it's very serious. I mean, after all, Germany is the backbone of the European Union, a $17 trillion economy. The United States and the EU is a robust trading relationship. It's a more than $1 trillion trading relationship. And the sense that the United States is getting conned and exploited and cheated by Germany, it's just not supported by the facts. As a matter of fact, BMW produces about 400,000 cars in a factory in Spartanburg, South Carolina, Donald Trump country in many ways, and they export more cars than any other U.S. manufacturer in the U.S. So these trade relationships can't be simplified as bad, good. They do benefit both sides.
Lester, the fact that the president complained to his NATO partners about money for the organization, the fact that he didn't get on board to the climate accord at the G7 meeting, should that surprise us in any way? Because these are things that he said during the election campaign. No,
I don't think that should surprise us at all. And in fact, I think he's on pretty sensible ground in both cases. It's true that I think only 5 NATO members are actually spending the 2% of their gross domestic product on defense, which is their obligation under the treaty. So it's appropriate to bring up that issue when talking with his NATO colleagues. Maybe he shouldn't have done it in that manner, and maybe some of the body language was a little bit off, but that message is actually a good message. And then on the climate treaty, President Trump was very clear during the campaign that he was a skeptic on the climate deal. Climate deal, by the way, that was never submitted to the Senate for ratification. It's merely an executive agreement. It only has Barack Obama's signature on it. It does not have the force of law in the United States. So for President Trump to walk away from it is simply a change in policy. It's not a change in law or anything. So I think on both of those cases, he's actually on pretty solid ground. I think it is of concern, though, that some of our NATO allies were left thinking that the U.S. is not necessarily with them under certain situations. And that's something that could have been done better while he was in Europe. And it's probably something he'll have to go back and fix.
All right, let me get Simon's view on this. And Simon, I just want you to listen to what the president told his NATO counterparts. Let's watch this.
NATO members must finally contribute their fair share and meet their financial obligations. But 23 of the 28 member nations are still not paying what they should be paying and what they are supposed to be paying for their defense. This is not fair to the people and taxpayers of the United States.
So, Simon, are we seeing here the president basically enunciate the America First policy?
Yes, I think you are. I mean, this is a president of the United States who consistently argued throughout the election campaign that in his view, NATO was obsolete. It was a tool that had been designed to battle the Cold War. That was all over. It wasn't playing a forthright role in the battle against international terrorism. Time, in essence, for the United States to move on a bit. Since he came to power and since his inauguration, he no longer uses the word obsolete. Indeed, concedes that he no longer thinks that NATO is obsolete, and it's perfectly appropriate, as Lester suggested, to raise the issue of payment during that visit to NATO headquarters, but not necessarily to the exclusion of everything else. The NATO leaders gathered there, given the opaque nature of Donald Trump's view on NATO, wanted to hear from him a full-throated articulation that he is signed on to Article 5, to the mutual defense covenants that lie at the heart of the NATO alliance. They didn't hear it. And the best that H.R. McMaster, his national security advisor, who is putting his reputation on the line now every single day for the man that he serves, the best he could say is that there was no need for the president to articulate it because everybody understands that's what he thinks. It's unspoken. He doesn't need to say it. Well, they don't understand that that's where he stands, and that's why he did need to say it, and certainly at some point he's going to have to go back, as Lester suggested, and fix it.
Ray, was there some damage done here to this defense alliance? Should the president have reinforced that Article 5 doctrine that Simon speaks about, that an attack on one is an attack on all?
The unspoken premise here is that the Russians are a menace. Now, if you don't read the New York Times every day, you might pause long enough to think, are the Russians really going to attack Europe? Or is it more likely that some hothead in Estonia is going to throw some bombs and get involved in a firefight with some Russian soldiers? In which case, are we going to put the United States at risk of getting into a war with Russia over some hothead in Estonia? You know, I think that we ought to just kind of realize that unless you see Russia this way we used to see the Soviet Union, NATO is obsolete. And if you've done these people to spend still more money on defense, they're going to start asking, defense against what? And then look at Russia, and let's see that all this business about Russian invasion, Russian aggression, and so forth, is made-up stuff, in Trump's words, because it wasn't the Russians that overthrew the government at Kiev. It was the West, and everything flowed from that. So unless people sit back and say, well, why would Trump say that's obsolete? Well, you know, it is obsolete. That's probably why he said it.
Simon?
And with the greatest of respect to Ray, NATO is not obsolete if you're an Estonian. It's not obsolete if you're a Lithuanian. It's not obsolete if you're a Latvian. And if you were observing the situation in the Crimean Peninsula, it wasn't the West that moved in and annexed it. It was Vladimir Putin that did it. So for large numbers of people that are nestled right along NATO's border with Europe, NATO is by no means obsolete. And they notice that today on Twitter, President Donald Trump was taking Germany to task, but has had absolutely nothing to say about Russia's aggressive behavior, which again feeds the narrative that there's something odd in the relationship between Donald Trump and the Russians.
Simon, you're reading the New York Times too much. When you talk about Russian aggressive behavior, you need to support that with evidence. And the only evidence you can support that with
the evidence
is the reaction
annexation
to
of
the
Crimea,
coup that we did on their doorstep in Kiev, that we did, and they reacted to as only Russians would react to, because Crimea holds their only warm water port. And if the U.S. thought they could get away with that without things happening to Crimea, then they know nothing about Russian strategic interests, which, by the way, should be taken into account.
Lester, the German Chancellor Angela Merkel, talking after Donald Trump had left Europe, she had this to say about the transatlantic relationship. Let's listen to her.
The last few days showed me that the days where we could completely rely on others are over. We are and will remain close partners. Germany is, of course, a close partner of the United States. We are and will stay convinced transatlanticists, but we also know that we Europeans really have to take our destiny into our own hands. That we Europeans have our destiny in our own hands, and that we do this together for Europe and for our values and interests.
So, Lester, has something fundamental changed in the transatlantic relationship, and has it had the unintended consequence of actually uniting the Europeans?
Yeah, I was going to make exactly that point.
Yeah.
And I think it's interesting that Trump's kind of slight mismanagement of the message in Europe is actually one of the things that's leading Europeans to kind of unite themselves and kind of think about what they're looking for in this relationship. And that could actually be a positive thing. I am going to disagree with my new friend Ray and point out that there's pretty good evidence that the Russians actually have invaded Ukraine. They are occupying Crimea and large parts of eastern Ukraine with military hardware and men under arms. And there's just no doubt about that. Russia is the antagonist here. And while you can make a grand historical argument that NATO may have gotten overextended in the last decade or so, we should all be real clear-eyed about Moscow's motivations here. They are looking for disunity in Europe. The United States should be promoting unity in Europe. That is in our national interest, and I don't think we should ever let go of that.
But did the Russians have a valid fear that Ukraine might fall into what was at that time called the Western orbit of influence that NATO might even, Ukraine might even become a member of NATO at some stage?
I think to the extent that Moscow is governed in a non-democratic way and in an opaque way and in perhaps a corrupt way, then yes, they did have something to worry about. But if they were pushing towards an open society that empowered the rights of their own people, then they have absolutely nothing to fear from the West.
Okay, Afshin, getting on to something else, and that is the climate change agreement. Sure. And as we know, there was, as Angela Merkel said, there was 6 against 1, or 7 against 1, if you count the European Union. Has this agreement been damaged?
I think it has been damaged, but we're still not sure. We were told by President Trump that he's going to make a decision on it, this week. I think that it certainly has been damaged. He said in the past that he didn't like the Paris Climate Accords, but what is happening here is also very interesting, Anand, because President Trump is with policies that he's projecting. He's almost telling the world that America has been exploited over these years and taken advantage of, et cetera, et cetera. But if you've sat in cafes in Cairo and Karachi and Buenos Aires to Bombay, that conversation is different. They view America as someone who has exploited them, has always looked out for their interests. So this is new to a lot of people in the emerging world, in the developing world, that an American president thinks that America has not been looking out for its own interests over the years.
He is talking to people on his base.
Sure, sure, absolutely. He is talking to people in his base, but the way it's projected internationally is very interesting because, America looking out for his interests, what else is new? That's the view out there in the rest of the world.
Simon, very quickly, we've got a minute left. How do you think countries like China and Russia are looking at all of this?
Well, this is the creation of a multipolar world. This is no longer going to be a country that the Americans would like to believe is a world of a sole superpower. This is now a completely new situation in which the United States, through its new president, is turning his back on decades of commitment to Europe and is ushering in a new era in which other countries are able to fill the void that the United States leaves. I think that's just the reality of the situation that we're in.
Lester, you are shaking your head. Quickly, 10 seconds.
I think that's going way too far. Yeah. President Trump went to Europe and told our NATO allies, hey, it's time for you to pay your dues. That's a good thing for NATO. It's a good thing for European countries to spend their money on defense. That's actually something that will strengthen the alliance. I completely disagree with Simon.
Okay, we're going to have to end it there. Thanks to all of you for joining us. And that is it for this edition of The Heat.